In today's video, we're doing an article review looking at the article Athletic Play Surfaces and Injury Risk by Dr. Yurgil and others. It's a really interesting article looking at the relationship between playing surface and injury. So we'll kind of go over the different playing surfaces and the costs and benefits of each. So when looking at natural grass, one of the biggest downsides is that it requires a lot of upkeep and it is prone to environmental factors. So if there's a drought, if there's harsh winter conditions, if it's raining a lot, those are some conditions where natural grass is not as effective. Looking at artificial turf, it's a lot more cost effective. It doesn't require as much upkeep. However, the original artificial turf led to higher injury rates because of the firmness of the artificial turf. So that's kind of what this research kind of looks over, and how artificial turf has grown and changed over the years to try to mitigate that risk of injuries. This article also looks at the playing surfaces that tennis is played on. Tennis was originally played on grass, and certain tournaments are still played on grass, but a lot have evolved to play on clay. The benefit of clay is that there is a low coefficient of friction, which allows a lot of sliding. Additionally, some courts are actually made out of acrylic. That is the most beneficial when we're looking at upkeep. It's very simplistic and doesn't require a lot of upkeep. However, because of the stiffness of the court and the high coefficients of frictions, acrylic courts are kind of correlated with higher injury risk. In addition to natural grass, artificial turf, and tennis surfaces, this article also looks at indoor sport surfaces. Currently, there's not enough research on the different types of indoor flooring in regards to athlete safety and injury prevention, but it is expected that injuries are more prevalent on more firm surfaces, and that's due to the changes in vertical acceleration and shock absorption. Now that we've looked at the individual playing surfaces, we're going to break it down sport by sport. When looking at soccer, there's two Norwegian studies that looked at youth and amateur soccer that showed no differences between overall injury rates between natural grass and artificial turf. However, in Japan, playing soccer on artificial turf greater than 80% of the season was found to be a risk factor for fifth metatarsal fractures. Two studies by Field Turf showed that compared to natural grass, there were lower overall injury rates on artificial turf compared to natural grass in both men and women's soccer. It is important to state that it is conducted by a artificial turf company, so take that into account. Moving on, however, we see that male athletes suffered more foot and ankle injuries on artificial turf, while female athletes experienced more lower extremity injuries on natural grass. A study by Howard and others found that there was no overall differences in competition injury between artificial turf and natural grass, but that injury rates during training was actually higher on natural grass. Three studies looking at professional men and women soccer players in Europe found no difference in overall acute injury rates, but Extrad and others did find a higher rate of ankle injuries in male professional soccers on artificial turf. Lastly, looking at injury rates in the MLS showed no difference in acute injury rates and no difference in knee injuries between artificial turf or natural grass. When looking at American football, studies done within the NCAA showed that there were higher ACL injuries on artificial turf, but there's other research that showed that PCL injuries were actually higher on artificial turf, and only ACL injuries were higher for Division II and Division III level competitions. A study by Hirschman and others found that there was an increased overall knee and ankle injuries on artificial turf, and that while ACL injury rates were significantly higher, there was no difference found on the MCL or lateral ankle injuries. And I think this point right here is the main takeaway of this article in regards to American football. Compared with shear failure as an inherent safety mechanism of natural grass, the inability of synthetic surfaces to release a cleat under a potentially injurious force has been postulated as a mechanism of an increased lower extremity injuries seen on artificial turf in this population. Now, when looking at research within the NFL, Lawrence and others found that there was no difference in acute knee or ankle injuries when looking at natural grass versus artificial turf. And finally, playing surface was found to not be a risk factor in Achilles tendon injuries in the NFL. Unfortunately, when we look at baseball, there's not enough research that compares injury rates when looking at artificial turf versus natural grass. When looking at rugby, research on European and Asian elite level rugby union found that there was no significant difference in the overall acute injury rates between artificial turf and natural grass. Some findings did show a trend of increased ACL injuries on artificial turf, but this did not meet the statistical significance. Visiting players who normally played on natural grass experienced prolonged muscle soreness after games on artificial turf, and artificial turf increased the risk of overuse injuries in Italian rugby players. Lastly, when looking at tennis players on hard court suffered more injuries of lower extremity joints and ligaments rather than soft tissue strains and trunk injuries. Higher impact force on the lower extremity during play, and an increased coefficient of friction between the athlete and the court predisposes athletes to lower extremity injuries. A mechanical study of playing surface showed that a lower coefficient of friction between footwear and a playing surface requires greater muscle control, which might increase the risk of fatigue and potentially injury. However, athletes playing on a hard court had an increased proportion of injuries to the lower extremities than those playing on grass and clay. This article also covered general medical considerations such as heat illness. One article found a significantly higher incidence of total injuries on field turf compared to natural grass on days where the temperature was over 70 degrees, but not on cold days where the temperature was less than 69 degrees. With that being said, it is valuable to continue to evaluate the multiple variables, including air and surface temperatures, affecting the EHI and other injuries to better understand the complex risk estimation. When looking at concussions, head to surface concussion occurred less frequently on artificial turf rather than natural grass in both male and female soccer players. Additionally, in competitive contact sports, concussion rates were lower on artificial turf than on natural grass. So in conclusion, the components affecting play and safety are not limited to artificial turf and infill. Rather, the environmental effects, player perceptions, microbiome, player surface interface, and the quality of maintenance all impact the forces and movement of the athlete and team. One of the shortcomings of the study is that it fails to identify where injuries occur within the sport. So does it occur during a cutting motion, a jumping motion, sprinting, tackling? I think that would add a lot of great context to the research so we could better understand where or in what situations injuries occur. Additionally, what injuries are most common in each sport? In regards to the study from Japan, it looked at fifth metatarsal fractures. Is that the most valuable, research that we can gather, or would we be better off looking at ankle and knee injuries? Lastly, this study states previously that footwear is outside the scope of this article, but it's really important to understand the relationship between footwear and surface to see if there's any correlation there between injury risk in athletes.